Welcome to the Strong Starts podcast with your hosts, Jessica Whitehead and Sarah Gerber-Kai.
Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about functional behavior assessments, or what we're going to refer to as FBAs throughout the episode, and behavior intervention plans, which we'll refer to as BIPs. And these are kind of like the bread and butter of what BCBAs get invited to do in schools. And so we figured that we'd kind of talk about them. And chances are this is going to be, Jessica, not just one, this will probably be a part one. Because even in prepping for this, guys, there was so much to dig into. So, hey, Jessica, could you kick us off just by telling us what exactly is an FBA?
So an FBA is a functional behavior assessment. It's rooted in applied behavior analysis. It is a type of evaluation, but it's not a diagnostic tool by any means. So a student or a client will not be diagnosed based on an FBA. It does help us understand the function of a student's behavior. So are they trying to get access to tangibles? Are they trying to have their sensory needs met? Maybe they're seeking attention or connection from somebody, or they're trying to escape, maybe avoid or get out of doing something, maybe escaping to something or away from something. In schools, the FBA may be part of an IEP or an individualized education plan. Sometimes they're attached to a 504, but students who are in general education can also have an FBA. Typically, they're done by a BCBA when we see the clinical setting, but that's not the case in schools. As much as we want BCBAs all over schools, it's not feasible. And so sometimes they're done by a school psychologist, and school psychologists are typically trained in doing FBAs as well. Maybe someone who is part of the evaluation team is doing an FBA. In clinics, they're done to help develop this individualized plan for treatment. In either setting, they can lead to a behavior intervention plan or some sort of behavior support plan for a client or a student.
Okay, so the goal of the FBA then is to be able to evaluate what is the behavior and what's the function of it. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, we're
Okay.
pinpointing the behaviors and being able to operationally define or very specifically define a behavior and what it looks like. And we're trying to get away from things like that are, they get overwhelmed. And instead of saying they get overwhelmed, what that behavior actually looks like and what they're actually doing, what's observable. And we're evaluating what the purpose of that behavior is for that student and why they're doing that behavior.
Okay. And then break it down for me. What is literally what gets assessed, or what does the tool look like?
Well, I know different BCBAs do it a little differently, and there's not one tool. So a lot of times we collect observational data, we collect data around, frequency of behavior, duration of behavior. It really does depend on what behaviors people are seeing. And there's tools that like the QABF, which is the questions about the function of behavior. We do a lot of parent interviews, teacher interviews, any staff that work with a student. The student is interviewed to the best that we can, depending on the student. We review records, collaborate with other support team members. Maybe there's other evaluations that have been done in outside clinics, or even academic evaluations that we take into consideration as well. And we come up with some pretty graphs and some pretty tables and charts and present our findings to the team.
You really do. Your FBAs and BIPs are always gorgeous.
Thank you.
But there is a lot of controversy around FBAs and BIPs. And this is where you and I got a little lost in the weeds while we're prepping for this episode. What are some of those controversies? What kind of things do you hear?
Oh man, there's many. And, I have to say, I don't disagree with them either in some cases. Like we've mentioned before, there's a lot of controversy around ABA in general. And does it do harm? Is it compliance-based? And we have the Bowmans. They came out with a book about your FBA as a fantasy. And we have great groups like the Alliance Against Restraint and Seclusion that do really great work. And they talk about this as well. And there's this claim that traditional FBAs, and I want to say traditional FBAs, ignore the impact of trauma and the nervous system, and they don't take into account there's other factors. There's a claim that FBAs are based on neuroscience and are very compliance focused. So this is some stir, and I think with the popularity of social media, we see comments more and more about these things.
Well, yeah, and I could see that because I'm trying for the trauma piece. Well, first of all, how would you even use, you mentioned that's in traditional FBAs. So paint a picture for me of a non-traditional FBA that is trauma informed and takes into account the nervous system.
Yeah, and I guess I shouldn't say all traditional FBAs. I feel
Okay.
like, and this is, I feel like it depends on how they were written. In every profession, you have the good and the bad professionals.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Mm-hmm.
there's always been FBAs or BCBAs who have written FBAs that take into account the trauma. I think there's been the select few that maybe haven't. And those are the ones that get noticed and highlighted and commented on. But I also agree on the worry about compliance-based FBAs or compliance-based goals. Anything around compliance is definitely a concern for me. Um, but we have a lot of pioneers in ABA and behavior and coming out with very trauma-informed FBAs. Or,
Mm-hmm.
Ross Green has come out and he even claims that FBAs should not focus on these punishment practices or consequences, but on these lagging skills. And it was called the ALSUP, but now it's the ASUP, about skill-based treatment and trauma-informed practices, and even as example FBAs that focus on that. Dr. Hanley, he's moved to the PFA, which is based on the ISCA, and it's called the Practical Functional Assessment, and it is very skill-based. And it focuses on functions of behavior in a different way than people are probably used to, and that they can all flow together. A student just doesn't do one function in isolation. They're just not trying to escape. There's other things in play there.
Okay. So we know that when folks experience trauma, like capital T trauma, that it limits or completely takes away their ability to choose how to respond, for the brain to choose how to respond when faced with certain stimuli. And it doesn't have to be like, okay, the child was like, I don't know, severely abused. And it's not like, okay, it's just when presented then with more physical abuse that their brain gets hijacked by their trauma wiring. It can be any sort of stimuli that's somehow just related to how the brain has been rewired by trauma. So when you're looking at the functions of a behavior, how do you take into account the fact that it might just be pure survival? And then how does that play into a BIP?
Yeah, I would add to that, though, yes, taking into account trauma, but medical needs in general. And
Okay.
so I think trauma is an important factor to consider. We also have medical diagnoses. So what we have are diagnoses and trauma and different, I guess, components that influence what a person has the ability to do and how their brain is wired. I think where the controversy lies is when we are putting in goals or we're not considering those components. So, are we asking a student or a client to do something they're actually not able to do or that their brain is not wired to do? And that becomes very problematic. And it's our
Yeah.
responsibility as BCBAs or professionals to take those into consideration when working with students and building skills and whatever treatment we're putting in place.
Yeah. So what do you do? I mean, because yeah, what do you do then? Because behavior is not occurring in isolation. It's happening in the context of a system, and it's happening within a body that is made up of many different systems. So what do you do then? I mean,
Well, first of all, we're
Mhm.
bound by an ethical code. So
Okay.
I want to highlight that as we're talking about this before I say what we're going to do, because I want people to understand that there is an ethical code BCBAs have to follow. And if they're not following that, then that is problematic. And that is something that needs to be reported. But we have these responsibilities. There's a section about client rights. It should be minimal restraint and isolation, which to me is zero, right? We should not be
Yeah.
restraining or isolating. Preserving dignity. We talk about humane care, that we're doing our best. We're keeping people free from harm. We don't want people to be abused. We want to honor their consent. There's also a section, and this is where it becomes tricky in schools, since schools are not the same as clinics, but we do have to consider medical needs, and we have to ensure medical needs are addressed and assessed. So if there's, an impact that could have medically on a student's behavior, then we need to know that and understand it and understand the impact that has. And we also have to understand there's biological variables, there's genetics that play a role, there's trauma that plays a role, and all of our practices need to be rooted in scientific evidence. So we can't just come up with these random things that mean nothing, or we can't use practices that have been debunked by research. And it's our goal to use evidence-based practices that do reduce the risk of harm, and that could be used later on in these naturalistic conditions. So it makes sense to work with students on this skill because they will need it later on. Other big thing that we take into consideration is the environment. And that's hard in schools as well, since it's a very stimulating and compliance-based environment. But most importantly, BCBAs need to act in the best interest of their clients. So understanding their clients, understanding their needs, understanding their medical conditions, their diagnoses, even their cognitive ability, the trauma, and what is impacting them. So when we are making these plans and we're making these FBAs, we need to note those factors. There is usually, depending on the template that you use, there's a place for other considerations or factors to consider, and how we're writing that in the FBA and making sure that the team understands that it is important that we understand these pieces as we're putting goals into place.
Well, and this is where I see BCBAs really overlapping with social work, because you're having to consider all of the different factors that are impacting this one child or adult.
Mm-hmm.
And so that becomes really complicated when you are in an environment or in a position where there aren't the resources available to be able to refer out, And so I know, like, in my experience, I've worked with a lot of clients where I know that there's something else impacting them, but now they're on a wait list for a year for a service that they need to be able to address an underlying medical condition. How do you FBA or BIP that? And do you not? Like, does your ethical code say you can't?
Well, and that's gray. That's a gray area. And I think when we were talking about FBAs in schools, it's a different bear. We cannot, and we have to be very careful in schools about referring people out. We cannot say, hey, this is a referral to a medical provider. In schools, we can have conversations with families, we can brainstorm topics, but we cannot say, hey, you need to go see this doctor. As soon as we say that, we become responsible, and there's this whole policies about that with your school districts and states and everything. So if you want to know more about that, please feel free to look at all those legal policies. So that's where it becomes tricky for BCBAs. Okay. I have some students I work with that are on a 6-month wait list. And right now, because of that, I have to do the best I can. I only have the student for the 9-month school year. And we really want the student to be successful in school, and we want their best interests. We do the best we can to rule out what we can, not being a medical provider, and working with trying to dig into what the student is able to do and what they can understand. But that is definitely something I've wrestled with the entire time being a school-based, BCBA is, I can't always rule out the medical factors, and I can't control their medical treatment.
Right. Well, and then I've always been suspicious of the fact that FBAs and BIPs get utilized in schools where schools are compliance-based systems. And so at what point is the BIP really more, is the BIP ever really more about the adults and appeasing the adults than it is about helping this child to thrive?
And I'll say they usually are. So what happens is we're struggling to find answers. We have this behavior that is out of control and we can't get a handle on it. And so the answer is an FBA. And I do think it's because we don't know what else to do. But what, my responsibility is to convey to staff that FBA, as great as they are, is not always the answer. And there's so much we can do before getting to an FBA. It does get tricky because there was federal guidance that came out in 2024 from the Department of Ed. It's not a policy, but it is a guidance document about FBAs in schools, and they're strongly encouraged. But can we do some interventions? Can we dig a little deeper? Is it because they're frustrated every time you give them math? Is there something we can do to meet these needs before we just slap an FBA on it? And, as much as I think they can help us understand a behavior, I think in order to do justice to the FBA and justice to the process, there's a lot we can do prior to doing an FBA. And there's times where, and this happens a lot, and maybe some of you out there can identify with, is okay, it's getting to this place where the behavior we don't know what else to do. And so we really need to do an FBA, but I also have my own ethics. So there's that balance. I have to uphold ethics. But anyway, what happens is I start this FBA and it's beautiful, and I get some good data and I have some momentum going with this FBA. And then suddenly, other people realize, well, if we're doing an FBA, this must be serious. So suddenly, the parents take the kids to the doctor. A couple weeks into the FBA, this student starts medication for ADHD or whatnot. And then, we change the placement of where the student is in the school. So we give them a different learning environment. And then all these variables get put into place that really should have been done prior to the FBA even started.
Yes. Well, and this is where I'm kind of going to this is where I call bullshit on the whole thing. Because on top of that, environments are biased, and they actually, in that guidance that you mentioned about functional behavior assessments, they mentioned that in the introduction, which I found super interesting, that there is a disproportionate use of exclusionary practices, disciplinary practices for students of color, particularly Black children and students with disabilities. And so, our environments themselves are biased. They're not set up for people of color. They're not set up for queer youth, for children with disabilities. And that's why we have all these anti-discrimination laws to protect them. And so to what extent are we just creating these behaviors as a system? And then, like you said, you come in and you're like, okay, I'll do an FBA, but then everybody kind of gets their shit together and is like, oh, okay, wait a minute, let's actually change the system around us. Let's change our family system. And now all of a sudden, the behavior's gone.
Right?
How do you deal with that?
It is so hard because we have this consent. The FBA might be part of the IEP process, and the student might be undergoing special education evaluation. You've started this process midway through, you're reevaluating your data, and you have now a different set of data you're collecting, and you're comparing data, and then someone has to interpret that data to make behavior goals. And it's really difficult. And there's times where I've had to put that in and hey, this much time went by, a new intervention was started, a medical intervention was started, a placement was changed, and then, we're bound by a legal time frame to complete that FBA. And it does get so tricky. And there's times where I've just had to write that in there. Hey, this has happened. So prior to this happening, this is what we saw with the behavior. After this happened, this is what we're seeing with the behavior.
Often it's the externalizing behaviors, what we might think of as being aggressive behaviors that kind of alert people, hey, like Jessica, I need a BCBA here. I need help. But sometimes those behaviors, like we've talked about, standing on a table, like that might really upset somebody because they have, their own amygdala is like enlarged and really heightened, and they think, that's a very scary thing. In cases like that, where you're like, okay, well, we can address this behavior, but maybe you're really just scared of this behavior because of your own shit. How do you address that in an FBA?
Oh, that happens all the time. So let's take one student, and one student will have a teacher in, say, I don't know, first grade. And in first grade and second grade, they have this similar behavior. Like we don't see really a change in what the behavior looks like. However, we have the first grade teacher who has a different tolerance level than the second grade teacher. And that also is an environmental factor that we have to consider. And so sometimes when we put in a plan, there's also staff directions in a plan. So we do have sheets, and we attach if the student does this, this is how we're going to respond. So it's not necessarily bad to have a plan for a student who has problem behavior that's, I guess, more, the adults have a trigger about. So like you said, okay, that to this staff member, this seems unsafe. To this staff member, it doesn't. So I don't necessarily view as a bad thing, but what I think is important is the directions to staff in that, and understanding that, yeah, there's a problem behavior from the student, but really the staff and the environment make a difference in that behavior too. So how
Okay.
can we address those environmental factors to help with that behavior as well? Because we can't just expect the student to change and do nothing. Like that's silly,
Yes.
especially when working with kids. Like the kids need support. And even when you look at social emotional standards that you and I dive into all the time, a lot of those talk about with adult assistance or what we can do as a village for this person.
Yes. Well, and I guess like I've seen sometimes where it gets even more nuanced where there are things that they're behaviors that say this. It's the way that the child copes, right? But maybe like to the outside observer seems like no, we don't want them to cope in that way. And even if it's something that's not harmful, but they're just like, oh, it's I mean, I've even heard people describe them as weird. But this is something that which I would never say. But anyway, but this is something we need to change this because this is going to be a problem for them later on. That I feel like especially when you described your ethics code, seems like something that you wouldn't be able to put into a BIP. Is changing those types of
Right.
behaviors.
Well, and this is where trauma informed practices come into play too. So let's say at home, this student has been abused physically
Mhm.
or has seen somebody abused. And they have crawled into small spaces to get protection.
Mhm.
And at home, they have learned that this is a survival piece, right?
Mhm.
And this is where, the consequences and behavior practices all kind of tie together. They have learned through experience that this behavior has created safety. When I crawl into a solid space, this person can get me and I am safe. So at school, when something happens that's overwhelming or they're trying to figure out how they can escape a situation or they don't like that maybe somebody else is being aggressive or, there's something that happens in class that bothers them and they crawl under a desk or a table. Well, the trauma informed piece would be to understand that you might not know the trauma behind the student, but understanding that for some reason, this student finds this behavior acceptable. Okay.
Mhm.
And so you might not start a goal about coming out of a table. Like you're not going to write a behavior goal. That's compliance, right? The student will not get under a table. The student will not crawl under a table. That would be not a trauma informed goal. So a trauma informed goal would be a lot of skill based around, frustration tolerance, functional communication around expressing themselves, how we deal with things that we don't like in a safe way, but also understanding that everything we do in school when they get home can be undone. So we do what we can and we make goals that create safety for that student. How can we make that student feel safe? How can we help them feel successful when they ask for things in a different way? Um, really taking into account that students have these experiences outside of school that we have no control over, and they still need a sense of safety when they're in school.
Is there an ethical responsibility to address the things happening outside of school?
There are ethics around consulting with other providers to make referrals for families and to help them address those needs.
Jessica, we're running out of time, and I really do think we could dig into so much more about this. But one other thing that I wanted to address before we go, because I see it come up so much on social media as just a general question people have about FBAs and BIPs, is who's responsible for carrying out a behavior intervention plan?
Oh, goodness. Well, okay, if we're going to talk about clinics, now clinics have this, beautiful environment of BCBAs, RBTs, and all these people to carry this out. If we're talking about schools, it's whoever is available. Like I don't have a team of RBTs I can deploy out to carry out any sort of plans or treatment. And so I am one person in an entire, district, and I write the plans or somebody else writes the plans. And I try my hardest to support everyone I can in implementing those plans. But I'll be honest, we're spread thin. So,
Yeah.
if the student's on an IEP, then their case manager is responsible. And if they're on a 504, whoever's the case manager for 504s. Now, if they're a student who doesn't have either and they're a student in general education with no case manager or anything like that, then that's the whole team. The teacher needs to make sure that's, I don't even know how to
Yeah.
say it. Like it's a responsibility of so many.
Yeah.
And I know when I say that, the reason I hesitate is because it puts more on the teacher.
Yes.
And I know what that's like as a teacher, but it's true. If you have a student with no case manager who has an FBA and a behavior plan, it is the teacher's responsibility to implement that plan or consult with other. That's why you got to have other people on your team, man. You've got to
You
have,
really do.
you have to find somebody that can support you. Beg, borrow, get whoever you can to help you implement that plan. And here's the other thing, Sarah, is as we're talking about this, and I know we can talk forever, but resources are also a problem too in schools. We're short staffed. We don't have, the financial backing that we need to when we implement plans. So we do what we can within what we have.
Well, yes, but I'm glad you said that because as we've talked about before, if that's the reason why a BIP isn't, if that's a reason why a student isn't meeting their goals is because the BIP can't be implemented with fidelity because of resources, then say that.
Say that and write a new one because we can't put things in place that can't be done. If you have to take into consideration the fact that, it's like, okay, you're not going to write that a student gets Starbucks every day at the end of the day because financially that wouldn't be responsible and also questionable ethically anyway.
Sure, yes.
I'll throw that in there just so I don't get reported for that. I don't give students Starbucks every day, trust me. And so what we're going to do is write the BIP that's in best interest of the student or the FBA for the best interest of the student, also considering what we have available to us at the same time.
Yeah, because we don't want students to fail or fall through the cracks because we don't have the resources. And we certainly don't want to put that responsibility on the student to somehow be able to meet all their goals without having the proper resources that they need to make that happen. Jessica, thank you for diving into this with me today. I hope that we get to talk about this a bit more. I feel like we have a lot more to say. But thank you all for joining us, for listening. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and follow us on social media at Strong Starts Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Bye, everybody.
Bye.